half an hour?
Yeah, that sounds great. All right,
Okay.
cool. So I just started it, so I'll give a little formal introduction for you. So hi, everyone. I'm here with Dan Ariely, who is a professor of psychology and behavioral economics at Duke University. He's written Predictably Irrational, which I just did a video on, and also Upside of Irrationality and The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. And I'm very thankful that as a college student, I get access to a library. Otherwise, I'm not sure if I would have been able to read those. But yeah,
No,
so
they're also available for illegal downloads if you're keeping to the true ability of college.
yeah, I think didn't you actually talk about that? And I think it was one of your books saying something like, "Oh, I wanted to see how difficult it would be to download the PDF," and it wound up being very easy.
Yeah, actually, when I have a book on dishonesty called The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, and that one I was shocked because I think that on the first weekend when it was out, it was downloaded 20,000 times in some from an illegal website. So
Yeah,
it's kind of funny to see that's the place.
yeah, and I'm not an author, so I can't necessarily speak to this, but I feel like obviously it hurts your sales that you don't get money and things of that nature. But does it in some small way feel good that at least that many people care enough to do that?
So it's a mixed it's a mixed blessing. So for me personally, I have a day job. So I teach. I can afford my livelihood, so that's not a big issue. But so personally, I'm very happy when more people download it illegally because but for the book industry in general, it worries me, right? So if you say somebody like me that is writing on the side, that's one thing. But what about the people that their livelihood is from writing? Is the illegal download industry basically making it so that these people cannot live, and therefore we're hurting books and all kinds of media, right? So that worries me.
Yeah, and that's a pretty fair point because I mean you did sort of start off as a professor and doing all those things. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so I actually read Predictably Irrational, I think. I'm a junior in college now studying psychology, and I read it right before the summer I went in, and I just reread it because I sort of wanted to do this video just because I love this stuff. And actually, so, okay, obviously you're talking about things like anchoring effects and framing and decoys. So I went to, my college offered kind of like a, I don't know, meet and greet type thing with some Nike marketing executives, and I go to Penn State.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about these exact same things. They were talking about decoys and anchoring and stuff like that. And I was going, oh, this is very cool. But then I sort of realized that they were using those things to just make more money. And I remember sitting there thinking something like, this was really cool learning this, but I don't want to see it being used to sort of, I guess, make other people pay more. So I was curious on what your thoughts are about like how the research you do is used by other people.
Yeah, so I think it's a real interesting question. So, when I teach my class, I tell the students, look, you've just figured out a few things about human nature and some tools to get people to behave in a different way, and it's kind of up to you to decide whether you want to use it for good or for bad. I recommend the good. I can't force you, and it also creates some personal dilemmas. So a while ago, I got a call from a big tobacco company, and they said, come and do a workshop for us, and we'll pay you a lot of money. And I called the American Tobacco Association, and I said, look, I got this offer. If I go, I'll give you the money, the American Cancer Society. Would you like me to go or not go? And the Cancer Society said, yes, go. We prefer the money than the advice. I decided not to go eventually. But it is a tricky situation. It's a tricky situation of how do you want to use this data, and there are clear cases, right? If we get people to be healthier, or if we get people to save more money, but there's lots of trickier.
Yeah, and that's well, I think one, I commend you because you hope that everyone would sort of look into something as that, like, oh, well, if I'm doing this for the tobacco companies, is that necessarily something I want to promote? So I commend you on that front. But yeah, I totally agree that there are sort of ways that you can use it to, I guess, help the general public.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Richard Thaler. And so in Nudge, he talks about just default options for things like 401ks or just very, very simple ways to help people save more. And you do a lot of that too.
Yeah. So you basically say red wine. Let's agree that some red wine is good, but how much?
Yeah.
Is good. Or even savings. Some saving is good, but for example, the Chinese seem to be that are saving too much, right? And so how do you figure out exactly what you're comfortable with and what are the lines? There's not a scientific answer for that. You just have to convince yourself that you're doing something that even if you were not paid for, you would still want to have the same outcome. So if you get a job and you work for Nike and you're getting people to do something X, you have to convince yourself that that X you would have wanted it even if you were not getting paid. And if you can do that, if you can take that step, then it means it's probably for good.
Or at least you're good at convincing yourself. Yeah. I actually, so I was in a psych lab at Penn State, and one of the experiments that I was working with was actually sort of heavily influenced by some of your framing stuff. So, stuff with check this if you want to be an organ donor, if you don't want to be. So the guy in my lab, whose name was John, he was doing an experiment that was trying to find, I guess, the origin of framing, which is obviously quite a daunting task. But he basically looked at it in physical tasks and saw that when he asked people to, bring one end of a bar to this color or the other end of a bar to a different color, theoretically you could spin a bar clockwise or counterclockwise, but depending on how he would phrase it, they could predict with something like 70% accuracy which direction they would turn it. And
what kind of framing did he try?
So basically, I don't actually know if this is published yet, so that's why I hope I'd be able to link you an article. But basically, the bar, kind of like, imagine a door frame, right? And there are 3 slots you could put this bar into, and each side of the bar is colored. So let's say a green and a blue. And each door frame level is also colored, so let's say green side, blue side. And you could say something like green end of the bar goes into blue A. And so then you could turn the bar like this, or you could turn it like this.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, depending on whether it was above or below them, they could predict with a higher than 50% chance which direction they would actually turn the bar. And so that
but it was about height, not about framing. So the framing was in terms of the height of it. It was not language. It was not different phrases.
Well, no, sorry, I think I misspoke. It seemed like the participants were doing the framing themselves.
I see.
Because when they went up than when they went down, but even going down, it was still more than a 50% chance of it happening.
I see. So the framing was whether the word was up or down.
Yeah, it just kind of seemed like they were framing it themselves, and we just said, put this end. No, sorry, the framing wasn't up or down. The framing was basically the colors and the ends of the pipes and the insertion places we specified.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about framing in general terms, it's basically kind of a filtration of thought through some activity, right? And the idea is that different framing create different filtration. So if you get one kind of frame, you started thinking about something in one context, you get a different frame, you start thinking about it in a different context. And then no wonder that the context is going to matter. And there's lots of examples of this. So framing is a big issue. For example, think about the political questions that we have right now. So we've been asking people questions about inequality and what levels of inequality people think is the right level to have in the US. And the mindset that you have toward this inequality basically changes dramatically how people answer. So if I ask you the question of what if you take all Americans and you sort them on a line from the poorest to the richest, and then you break them into 5 groups, the richest 20, the next 20, the next, and the poorest 20. And I ask you the question of what wealth, what amount of resources should be in a society should be given to each of those 20%, right? In essence, what's the Gini coefficient? The rich should have more than the poor, but by how much? if I ask you the question in terms of wealth, people answer it one way. If I ask the question about health, for example, I say, babies die from time to time. What percentage of babies you think should die for the poorest 20%, the next? Now people answer it very differently in a much more equal way. Now, of course, the question about wealth is really a question about babies' mortality. It's the same question because the correlation between those is very, very high. But when you asked about wealth, not all aspects about wealth come to mind.
Yeah.
And when you ask questions about babies' mortality, you think about it just very, very differently.
Yeah,
so,
I'm sure it take. Oh, go ahead.
By the way, even the question about wealth inequality, Americans don't seem to understand the level of wealth inequality we have and don't want it. But when it comes to other things like education, people think very, very differently.
Yeah, and people don't, like you said, people don't always easily recognize that maybe wealth is more connected to something like health than we realize or would like to admit.
Yeah. That's
so this kind of, I'm wondering specifically, so you've obviously done so much research. What is the most counterintuitive result or just occurrence that you've ever read or found?
The most counterintuitive one. So I think for me, the most counterintuitive one is people's continuous insistency, that people continuously insisting that on aggregate we're rational. That's just kind of, I think, is the most bizarre one, where we have so many examples and everybody looks at themselves and people realize that they don't always wash their hands and text and drive and do all kinds of ways to waste our time. And at the same level, we basically keep on thinking that we're perfectly rational, or that if you take people in general that are perfectly rational. So I think that would be the first step, is that somehow our model of human behavior is so different than the model we experience day to day. And how that baffles me. And then if I had to pick another one, it would probably be something like overconfidence, where we experience lots of things in life that should shatter our overconfidence, but they don't. Are
you aware of the Dunningkruger effect?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. So I guess for those who don't know, it's just thinking you're much better at something than you really are, and it's when you enter a field where you can sort of see those who are better than you. It's easy to sort of have this experience. Like I play a couple of video games competitively, and when before you realize they can be played competitively, you think, wow, I'm amazing at this game. No one can touch me. But then you see people who are just doing totally different techniques that you didn't even know existed. And you see things like that.
I think that's basically what happened when you finish undergrad and goes to grad school. So when you're an undergrad, you read the textbook and you get the feeling that you've conquered the material. You read the whole textbook, you understand it. And then when you get to grad school, you realize how much more knowledge there is and how far you are from actually being able to conquer it. So
yeah,
I think there are many aspects of life where a little bit of knowledge gives us a sense of false confidence.
That the analogy of undergraduate graduate is interesting too, because it's people say when you're an undergraduate you have a small knowledge base but in a ton of things. And then as a graduate, you narrow down how much the depth or the breadth of your knowledge, but the depth increases.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's always, I don't know, it's an interesting trade-off. It's one that I'm not sure which I'd want to have. I'd like to have both.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why they call it a trade-off, because you can't have both. But the interesting thing is that when you haven't started exploring something in depth, you don't really understand the beauty of it. So, and I find it almost with all kinds of projects. So you start a project and you say, this is interesting, but as you dive more into it, you discover new depth and interest and nuances.
For sure.
Think about something like bird watching. You look at bird watching and you say, I can never be one of those. Like this is just a crazy hobby. I'm not picking on bird watching anything. But the moment you get into it, all of a sudden you see nuances that are just incredible. And
you're able to appreciate it more.
you start appreciating it. I mean, I have this thing with baseball. I didn't grow up in the US. Very hard for me to think about baseball as something that people want to watch. Very little is happening and so on. But the people who watch baseball say, you don't understand, there's a whole world of strategy and thinking and so on. But being an outsider, you don't see the beauty in it.
And I think we naturally tend to like what we're good at more. So if we just work to develop some skill, like you said, we can appreciate the finer points and then just, of course, get better and then like it more.
That's right. But it's not just the getting better. It's also the appreciation of the nuances. So if you start doing bird watching, you basically are able to analyze all kinds of small details. If you pay attention to baseball, you understand lots of things about baseball, can connect it to other aspects, the game become more enjoyable. So I think when you're standing right now, when you say, do I prefer breadth or depth, breadth gives you kind of almost an instant gratification because it's clear what you have learned. And depth doesn't, because it takes a while to develop expertise and start appreciating something. But I think it is really, really wonderful. I'll tell you about myself. So as somebody who writes from time to time, the more I write, the more I realize how much I have to learn.
Yeah.
But also the more I enjoy it. So I used to write much faster. I'm much slower now. But I if I have time, I really enjoy it like people enjoy sipping wine, where I basically think about the sentence and the structure and what exactly do I want to say and what exactly is the word. I don't always, sadly, have the time to do it slowly. But as I get better, I think there is a whole nother level of interest that is explored. And it's actually interesting because you would say that if what we enjoy is the process of getting better at something, every time you get better, you should switch to a new field. So you get better at soccer, and then you say, okay, I got to I'm slowing down my progress. Let me switch to squash, and you finish that. Let me switch to basketball, and so on. But
then I guess you would look at. You would look at then. How long does it take you to become to a point where you're going, I'm satisfied with this. Should I move on? Because then you could say, is it worth moving on to something else, or continue pushing yourself in that one vein?
That's right. But I think that what happens is that the one thing changes. So if you're a pianist, you're getting better in piano, but at some point it changes. And all of a sudden, even though the actual improvement is very small, you derive a tremendous joy.
Yeah.
From that.
And that's kind of like, I don't know if there's science behind this, but the 95-5 idea, or rather just diminishing returns, just that, it becomes, you have to put in more time and stuff to get better after certain points.
So I think that diminishing return is kind of the other theory, right? The diminishing return saying you're getting better, there's diminishing return, that's the time to switch. But I think that's not true, because what happens is as you get better, you start observing new things. So let's say it's basketball and you're getting better at basketball. At some point, yes, you're not really improving at the same rate, but you're finding new beauty.
Yeah.
Every time you make a shot, it kind of gives you a sense of understanding and so on, or whatever it is. Because otherwise, nobody should ever become a professional in anything. We should just try something, and then once we get to diminishing return, we should switch to something else and enjoy the process of improvement all over again.
Well, isn't the idea not that you get worse, but just that you have to put in more effort to sort of get to the highest echelons of ability?
Yeah, you need to. But again, it's about the question of whether it's ability or whether the thing that you're getting out of it is different.
Okay.
And I think that's basically what happens. So at some point, I think you start to get something else from it. Otherwise, the diminishing returns could never explain why we keep on doing the things we're doing for such a long time.
Yeah. No, and speaking of standard economic theory, so when I first read Predictably Irrational, I didn't know much about economics or psychology, and I was, I guess, shocked to learn that, economics assumes we're fundamentally rational. But that assumption makes sense in some ways. And so I've, wondered, does this render a lot of the even large-scale models that economics proposes invalid in a lot of ways? So
I think this is a question of how do we view economics. So economic has both a descriptive and a prescriptive side. What's the descriptive side? It's a side that says, I have a theory about human nature, and here's the theory. And then the prescriptive side, I have a theory, and this is what it means, and you should use it this way.
Mm-hmm.
So on the descriptive side, no theory is complete. Psychology is not complete, sociology is not complete, anthropology, philosophy, all of those are partial perspectives on human life. And from that issue, why attack economists? Why not attack sociologists or anthropologists that also have a partial view, or psychologists from that perspective? But you wouldn't, because nobody would have ever a complete theory, right? It's just not something possible to have. We don't have a good theory of particles. So, imagine what would happen if you say human beings are many, many particles put together with some thought and free will and some hysteresis and other effects. Really, really hard to predict.
Yeah.
The problem comes from the prescriptive side, right? Where economists said, we have a model, we have a theory, and you should build the world according to that. So imagine you had a theory about bridges, and that theory described 20% of human behavior. And you said, 20% of bridge behavior. And you said, let's now build a bridge based on that. That would be kind of irresponsible. And I think that's basically where we are with standard economics, where we say we have a theory, it's a partial theory, but let's create a healthcare system, let's create an educational system, let's create a taxation system based on that theory. And that's the part that really, really worries me, because I would not want to have a world that is designed assuming that people are perfectly rational.
Yeah, and I guess that's part of what you're doing, because you're kind of saying, hey, these things aren't bad, but I don't think you realize they're also incomplete. And so we should look at the other aspects that fit in too.
That's right. So if we're going to build a health system, let's look at all kinds of aspects of how people behave, not just the rational aspects. But basically my hope is that over time, behavioral economics would become just kind of an applied discipline of social science, which basically says, we're happy to take theory from everywhere. We can take theories from economics, psychology, sociology, whatever it is. And when you come to do something in the world, let's just first have a little bit of humility, so we don't think that we're necessarily right. Let's create some experiments, let's test something, and let's be sure that what we're doing is the right thing. And let's also remember that those are not the last tests. Let's say we're going to do a new education system, and we say, how do we improve education? We can't just do experiments this year and then start in 2017 a new healthcare system, because technology will change, and kids will change, and structure of parenting would change, and the kind of education we will need would change. So 10 years later, we would need some different things. So it's not something we could do and we can just stop. It's something we need to do and continue testing. So that's kind of my hope, that overall that's where we'll end up. We'll just end up by saying, let's have some humility, borrow widely from social science, try different things, estimate the best approach we can, and then keep on improving over time.
Yeah, I really appreciate that mindset, because, you look at things like healthcare or education, like you've mentioned, and people say, oh, well, they're the way they are because that's just how it is. That's how they work. And you'd like to assume that that's the case, that they are the way they are because they've been optimized, but there really hasn't been much critical examination of these types of things, at least with the options that currently exist today. And so it's really refreshing to see, I guess, people communicating ideas who have this mindset, because I think it's very critical.
And all of those have very strong default biases, right? So the odds are that the education system next year will be exactly like it is this year.
Yeah.
Forcing us to do experiments. I wrote a little bit about the FDA, and people complain about all kinds of things about the Food and Drug Administration, and there's lots of reasons to complain about them, but they force physicians to do experiments. Now, imagine we didn't have the FDA. What would happen? Physicians will have some ideas about what medications would work. Maybe it will be leeches or whatever it is, and of cough syrup, all kinds of things, and they will just give them. And they would give them to everybody without being forced to do experiments. Experiments are difficult, right? Every time you do an experiment, you have a belief of what will work better and what will work worse. And it's a very hard discipline to say, I believe this would work better than this, but I'm not sure, so let me try and test both of those. It's a very hard discipline to have in your own personal life. If you think about dating, I think that I like girl A more than girl B, but let me try girl B and go out on a few days just in case my intuition is wrong.
Yeah, no, I like that mindset. Someone actually who's watching this right now wanted to ask a question. So this person's name is Lorenzo von Breda, and he says, how does the fact that very religious people, for example, priests and people sworn to tell the truth, like witnesses in court, still commit crimes or lie?
So there's lots of answers for this, and there's lots of causes for this. So one thing that we find is that it's not just these people. Lots of people lie. And we lie, there are kind of two steps for lying. There's the first step of lying where we don't think of ourselves as bad people, but we have a conflict between two human values. So you say to yourself, somebody asked me, how do they look in their dress? I think honesty is an important thing, but I also don't want to offend the other person. So what do? You say honesty is important, not offending the other people is also important, not offending is more important. Let me say, you look great in that dress, or I love your haircut, or something like that. So that's the first part, and then people lie like this a lot. And we lie for all kinds of reasons. We say, this is actually the right thing to do, everybody is doing it, I suffered before, I'm just paying back. There's all kinds of ways to do it. And many of the lies, I think, are kind of like that. So if I'm just thinking about somebody who's a religious person lying for the church, or a politician lying for their political goal, it's basically saying, yes, honesty is important, but getting people to vote for me is even more important, because that would get the country to be on the right footing moving forward. So we have that and that part. And then there's another part in which people are really afraid of getting caught. And now it's not about rationalization, it's about a calculated risk, right? So imagine that you got caught doing something, and now you can give false count on it and try to get out. And now it's a very different story, because now it's not about thinking to yourself that you're still doing the right thing. It's just getting in a very defensive mode and trying to correct as much as possible so you don't get the punishment.
Yeah.
But interestingly, most lies don't start like this. They start by reformulating the world as if you're actually doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think it was in Honest Truth About Dishonesty, and obviously Predictably Irrational to an extent, where you talked about how we want to view ourselves as honest. We like that, at least most of us. And so when we do, little lies, we do them in ways that don't feel like we're really cheating or lying or being dishonest. We say something like, oh, well, this guy took something from me before, so that makes this okay. That's or right. Something small like that.
Yeah. So in the last 3 years, we've been interviewing all kinds of big cheaters, and we made a movie out of this called Dishonesty, the Truth About Lies. And it was very interesting to interview all these big cheaters, because as long as you do lab experiments, you ask yourself, is what I'm studying really limited to stealing, $10, $20, $40? Or is this the same story as people who steal hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars? Now, we can't do experiments on stealing such huge amounts. So what we did...
They happen frequently enough that we can use natural ones.
That's right. It will be expensive to do. So we talked to people who are doing that, who've done that. And the interesting thing is, when you look at what these people did at the end, you say, that's not me. I can't relate to those people. Those are very, very different people. But when you look at what they did as some first steps, you can really empathize and say, oh yeah, I can see myself doing that, because the first step was to pay myself back, or restore justice, or help other people, or all kinds of stories like that basically it's some conflicts of loyalty.
Yeah. All right. Well, Dan, I know that you sort of have your own busy schedule, and so I don't want to keep you too long. So I guess just the last thing I'll say is that I'm not sure if you get a chance to watch the video I sent you that I just uploaded here.
I did not yet, but I'll watch it tonight.
Cool. Well, I'll give you a little spoiler for the ending. So basically, I think I've emailed you this before, but just Predictably Irrational. I didn't really know anything about psychology before I picked up this book. I didn't know what it was. Maybe I assumed it was a stereotypical therapist type thing. I really don't know. But reading it was really, really fascinating, and it just showed me how people behave and how they think they might but don't. And it just blew me away that stuff like that even happened. And it's kind of the reason that I actually started to study psychology at my university, because I went as engineering. And it's just one of the reasons that, like, it's been kind of like a huge snowball effect. And it's one of the reasons why I do a lot of the cool things that I think I do today. So just on behalf of people that you've inspired to do things, I just wanted to say a heartfelt thank you, Dan.
Yes, thank you. It's a great compliment. It's a bit of a responsibility, but I'll take it as a compliment and not just a responsibility.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, I guess I'm going to stop the broadcast. That won't immediately end our discussion, just stop it from being live. But yeah, so thank you so much, Dan, for just sitting down and talking with me. And thank you for asking questions, everyone who did, Lorenzo.
Thanks a lot.
All right, cool. Goodbye, everyone.